Hey folks, 10.2 covered all of the different trig functions that we're going to be working with this chapter, sine, cosine, and tangent, and we shortcut that with SOHCAHTOA. So this stands for the sine function, and then cosine, and tangent. Right? Well, on your calculator, when you use these things, they shortcut it. They just call it SIN for sine, they call it COS for cosine, and TAN for tangent. On your calculator, you have those. Mine are right in a row right here. They may be in a different place if you have a scientific calculator, but they're there, just the shortened version of them. Okay? If while you were doing the 10.2 video, your numbers looked a little bit differently, it could be your mode. When we measure angles in geometry, we want to measure them in degrees. So if you have a problem, you need to just hit your mode button and make sure degree is highlighted. Usually that's not a problem for the scientific calculators, the smaller ones, but just kind of a heads up there. What's really important to note here for SOHCAHTOA is all of these things are split up into three pieces, 1, 2, 3. And they really have to do with the pieces of the triangle that we're going to use. In order to solve for a variable using SOHCAHTOA, we have to have two of those three things, okay? But what's important is we're dealing with, these are all ratios of sides on our triangle, so I'm going to just mark off a little angle here. And a lot of times they're going to use this little x or theta to represent an angle, but then that angle tells us how to label our sides. There are three sides to a right triangle. The first one is the most obvious, and you already know the name of this. Across from the right angle is called the hypotenuse. Okay? But then the other two sides we usually just call legs. We can be a little bit more specific. We want to say, compared to this angle, is the leg across from it or opposite of it, or is it next to it or adjacent? So we've got two other sides, adjacent and opposite. Opposite is straight across, and adjacent is the one that touches the angle. See how two sides form this angle? One of them is always going to be the hypotenuse. It's the other one, the one that's left. Okay, so that's what these OH, AH, and OA stand for, are either the opposite side, the adjacent side, or the hypotenuse of the triangle. So these are just ratios, okay? But with sine, cosine, and tangent, that angle was important. So the three pieces that are required to work through problems like this is one angle and two sides. Okay? But one of these things is going to be x. It's unknown, and that allows us to set up an equation to solve for it. Now with 10.2, you were solving for sides, so specifically one of these things was the x. We had to know an angle, and we had to know one side. So what we're going to do is just practice a few problems on your homework to make sure we really understand what's going on here. First up is the 7, 8, and 9. Now, they give us an angle to focus on, so there's one of our pieces. Okay, this one is just give the expression, give the ratio that represents the sine or the cosine here of the angle. So the first one, it says we're going to focus on angle G, so up here. Once you have an angle of focus, you want to label your sides. Okay, opposite, adjacent, hypotenuse. Okay, across from the right angle is always the hypotenuse. I like to label that one first. Then I like to label the opposite side, because it's across from something just like the hypotenuse is, but it's across from the angle you marked. So we mark G, across from that is 10, that makes that the opposite side. Then finally, the side that's left, that's touching angle G, is the adjacent side. So then, for this one, sine is the SO in SOHCAHTOA. So we just have to put opposite over hypotenuse, and that's our answer as long as it's reduced. So our opposite side was 10 over our hypotenuse was 14.1. It's not really nice to have a decimal within a fraction, so when you get that situation, just go ahead and type it in your calculator to reduce that for you. So 10 divided by 14.1. And we'll call that about 0.7. Then it says the cosine of g. We're still focusing on g, so all of these labels are still good, but it wants cosine, that's the ka in SOHCAHTOA. So we want to put the adjacent side over the hypotenuse this time. Well, adjacent was also 10, so it looks like 10 over 14.1 again, which means it's still that 0.7 from before. Lastly is cosine of n. Notice n is a right angle. Anytime you take cosine, sine, or tangent of 90, all I want you to do is type it in your calculator, okay? Because here's the problem. The opposite side of a right angle is the hypotenuse. It's not called the opposite. So this always causes problems. Anytime your focus is a right angle, you just type it in your calculator. You don't look at the picture at all, okay? The only options for the sine, cosine, and tangent of a right angle are going to be 0, 1, or undefined, okay? So we're just going to type in cosine of 90, and our answer is 0 for that, okay? So when it's 90, type it in. All right, that's not as important for when we're going to solve some equations, and that's what the next part is. Okay, we're going to skip down to number 18, where it asks us to solve for x and then solve for y. So what I want you to do always for this problem is mark the angle you're given first. Now, the 90 we said causes problems, so we're going to focus on the acute angle. So that means marking 55 degrees. Okay. Then what I want you to do is label the triangle based on that, opposite, adjacent, hypotenuse. Again, across from the 90 degrees, the hypotenuse is the easiest to see. Then across from that angle that you marked is always the opposite side. And then lastly, the side that's left is the adjacent. It's the one that's touching that angle but isn't the hypotenuse. All right? And what you want to do is solve for only one of these at a time. Okay, so what you're going to do is choose on one. I'm going to do x first just because that's how it's listed. So I'm going to ignore y for right now. With that in mind, it tells me use adjacent and hypotenuse. Those are the two things I'm dealing with other than the angle. So adjacent and hypotenuse we have to find in SOHCAHTOA to see what it goes with, sine, cosine, or tangent. And that's in the ka. So we're going to use cosine. But I told you with sine, cosine, and tangent, there's always three pieces, one angle and two sides. You always put the angle right next to sine, cosine, tangent. It comes first, just like in the alphabet. Angle, A, comes before side, S. So the angle was 55. Then we set up an equation, and those fractions that we are practicing up above, we put on the other side. So we said adjacent over hypotenuse, so the A goes on top, and then the hypotenuse on the bottom. So adjacent was 20, and then our hypotenuse was x. And now we have an equation that we get to solve, okay? A lot of times it's easier to cross multiply on these, okay? So if you put that first side over 1, we can just cross multiply to solve. So this says x times cosine 55. I'm always going to encourage you to write the x first. So x times cosine 55. And we'll just leave it like that for right now. And then equals 1 times 20 is 20. So if this says x times cosine 55, to get rid of it, to solve for x, we have to divide by cosine 55. On both sides. Then x is by itself, so we get to type that in our calculator just like we see it. So 20 divided by cosine 55. And there we are, 34.9. We're always going to round these to one decimal place, and we're done with that one. Okay, I told you that we were ignoring this y to start out with. Now that we're solving for y, we're going to ignore x. Okay, so that goes away. And we're going to do the same thing we did last time. We need to think about what sides we're working with. This time, it's the adjacent and the opposite. So we need to find what has O and A. Okay, originally I said A and O. It doesn't matter what order it is on how you write it down, but it has to match what it says in SOHCAHTOA. Okay, so here, the one that has O and A in it is this one, and the order they use is the OA. So we got to use that. So then, this T stands for tangent. Remember, after tangent, we always put the angle. After sine, after cosine, after tangent, the angle goes first. Our angle is 55 still. And then we're going to do equal this rest. Okay, O over A tells us our fraction. Our opposite side was y, and our adjacent side was 20. Again, sometimes it's easier just to cross multiply, throw that over 1, and then we can do it. I said always put this x first if it comes here. Okay, it doesn't matter if you do this side or this side first, okay, but just like on the other one, we want to put this tangent, the sine, the cosine at the end. So if there is a number, put it in front, just like we did over here. We put the x in front, we're going to put the 20 in front. So that's 20 times tangent 55 equals 1 times y is y. And y is already solved for, so that means we just have to type that thing in. Okay? The reason I'm having you put that number in front is because when we type it in here, tangent, as soon as you write that, it opens parentheses. We have to be sure that we close them if we put times 20 on the end. If we put the 20 in the front, you don't have to necessarily worry about that. So this is 28.6. And we're done. Okay. Another one of those that has x and y. It's a little tilted upside down, so it might be more difficult. Okay, so this is number 20. On number 20, we're solving for x first. Okay, remember, we want to label our triangle before anything else. Okay, so there's our right angle. Remember, mark the angle that you're given, the acute one, and then label opposite, adjacent, hypotenuse. Across from the right angle is the hypotenuse. Do that first. Then go across from the angle you're given. Call it opposite. And then finally, the last side is the adjacent. We're going to solve for x first, so we're going to ignore y. And then that tells us using adjacent and hypotenuse. Adjacent and hypotenuse out of SOHCAHTOA goes with C for cosine. So it's cosine. Remember, after that always goes our angle. That's 56.3 here. And then equals our fraction a over h. Okay, so a over h looks like adjacent is on top, x, and hypotenuse is on the bottom, 10.8. Again, we can call that over 1 and cross multiply. This says 10.8 times cosine of 56.3 equals, remember I always put that number in front even though it didn't come first. Makes our life a little easier to type it in. And then 1 times x is x. X is already by itself, so we got to just type that thing in. So 10.8 cosine 56.3, enter. And that looks like pretty close to 6, so we're going to call it 6. That one's done. And now we're going to ignore x so that we can do y. Okay? So y is the opposite and the hypotenuse, O and H. Looking up at SOHCAHTOA, O and H goes with S. S stands for sine. You don't have to remember what they stand for. It's on your calculator, the S, the C, and the T. Just figure out what they go with what you see with your calculator. And then that goes with 56.3, just like the other one. What's different is we put this one equal to opposite over hypotenuse. So our opposite was our y, and our hypotenuse was our 10.8. Again, over 1 we can cross multiply. So 10.8 times sine of 56.3 equals 1 times y is y. Y is solved for, so we get to type this whole thing in. So it looks a lot like the other one, but we're going to use sine instead. So 10.8 sine of 56.3 is 8.98, looks really close to 9, so 9 it is. All right. Sometimes on problems, you're not given an x or a y. or an x and a y, you're just given one. That actually makes your life easier. Okay, you're still going to follow the same process. So you mark your angle, figure out the right angle so that you can label opposite, adjacent, hypotenuse. Okay, so for us, opposite, adjacent, hypotenuse, we want to start across from the right angle is hypotenuse. Across from the angle we marked for our acute angle is the opposite, and the one left is adjacent. Okay, when there's not two variables, you want to cross out the blank side. Okay, the hypotenuse doesn't have anything on it, so we can't use it. If all sides are labeled, you can use anything, SOHCAHTOA. You pick your favorite. We just have to include this opposite side because that's our variable that we're solving for. So opposite and adjacent for this one, that's O and A, which is TOA in SOHCAHTOA. So that's tangent of the angle, 22.6, equals O over A, so the opposite side was X, and the adjacent side was 12. Again, we're cross-multiplying to solve this thing. 12 times our tangent, 22.6, equals 1 times x is x. X is solved for. We just got to type that thing in. So that looks like for us, 12 tangent, 22.6, and that looks like really close to 5. And that's it. If you have any other questions, be sure to sit in on one of our Zoom sessions so that you can get those answered. Good luck.